Tengo un amigo que me ama, me ama, me ama. Yo tengo un amigo que me ama, su nombre es Jesús.
The day was September 19th, 1985. The time was 7:18 in the morning. The delicate needle of a seismograph at a laboratory in Palisades, New York, told a silent but terrifying story. It took just 23 seconds, yet 10,000 lives were snuffed out. 60,000 people were injured. An earthquake had struck Mexico City. Never before had an earthquake of this magnitude, 8.1 on the Richter scale, struck such a large city. It was a disaster of an unprecedented kind. But there is an organization to which disaster relief is second nature, and within 1 hour, the Salvation Army in Mexico City had set up its emergency headquarters.
As soon as the house quit shaking, we realized that there was a more serious circumstance than we had originally thought. We could hear sirens. We turned on the radio and realized from the reports on the radio that there was serious damage in the city. We realized, too, that we'd have to have some kind of a headquarters for the operation, and the most logical place for this was the Core Number 1 building in Colonia Morelos. This building actually is an old warehouse that was secured a number of years ago and has been converted into a core building. But this was right in the middle of the Colonia Morelos area, which was one of the most severely hit areas in the city. People with so little lost so much in that area. And of course, with the earthquake happening right almost at breakfast time for many people, it became apparent that there was going to be a need for food service immediately.
First on the scene were the cadet officers from the Salvation Army Training College, located in the city.
I went to the bank and took out 200,000 pesos and went to the store, grabbed 2 carts and filled the carts up and got back to the school where they were heating the water and filled up the containers that I'd been able to purchase, and as soon as possible downtown to serve the people who were doing the rescue work. I found the cadets were already serving with the divisional commander. Some of them were inside of the half-collapsed buildings, helping to remove rubble so that they could help get people out. The whole downtown area was just a pall of dust of the buildings that had collapsed and the wind blowing the dust around. There were areas cordoned off. There were buildings in the street. People were confused. It was a matter of going up one-way streets the wrong way, going on the sidewalk where necessary. I'll never forget my first reaction to the first building that I saw that had fallen. Buildings that I had really expected would be able to hold up. Our building hadn't shown a crack, and yet these beautiful modern buildings were completely on the ground. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Apart from the dead and the injured, some 200,000 people were now homeless. In addition to losing their homes, many had lost loved ones, all their possessions, and their jobs as well, when the factories where they worked were destroyed. They were called LosDamnificados. That chilling word, with its resonance of lost souls back through the centuries, captured the drastic nature of their plight. It was clear that a major effort would be needed to come to their aid, and the Salvation Army went right into action. The story of that effort, what it was able to accomplish, and how it was put together is a fascinating one. It involved a partnership between the Salvation Army and literally thousands of civilian volunteers of all kinds from across the United States and Canada. The first requirement, as it is with all relief efforts, was for accurate information. When any major disaster strikes, there's always an initial period of confusion. To make matters worse, in this case, Mexico City was virtually cut off from the outside world by the disruption of the overseas telephone exchange. Radio was the only answer. Direct radio contact had to be established between this country and Mexico City. That leads us to a dramatically different setting, a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, and the home of Quint Nelson, a ham radio operator who had helped the Salvation Army several times in the past. Quint immediately set up a three-way radio link between his station in Covington, Georgia, the Salvation Army operator in Mexico City, and the nearest U.S. territorial headquarters, which are also in Atlanta.
We handled that by setting up a Bell telephone line, putting a headphone set on, so when the phone rang, I could have a hands-free operation to work with the computer. A Salvation Army officer was on hand in Mexico City at the other station. The answer would come back immediately. As the answer was coming across the screen, I could relay it right through the headset to Major Michaels anywhere that he might be in the United States. And we handled a lot of that, many hours of that type of communication.
On Friday, September 20th, the day after the earthquake, Mexico City was shaken by a second severe earthquake, measuring 7.5 on the Richter scale. Buildings weakened by the first shock now came crashing down. 2,000 miles away, in San Francisco, Lieutenant Colonel Ray Robinson made a decision.
I, along with everybody else, had the impression that the entire city was devastated and felt in true Salvation Army spirit we must do something about that.
So Colonel Robinson decided to put together an emergency team of medical and disaster relief specialists. In the next 24 hours, a call went out for experienced volunteers who would go to Mexico City for at least 1 week. One of the first volunteers came from Children's Hospital in Oakland.
Much to my surprise, when I went home, there was a message in my answering machine. They had been looking for me, and indeed there was a group of people they were putting together to fly to Mexico City. These were nurses, physicians, paramedics, engineers, a very diverse group, not only in terms of professions, but also in terms of ethnicity. We had people from the Philippines to West Africa.
By the time the evening came, we had decided which would be the most qualified people to take with us on a plane, a B-727 that we chartered for $35,000. I didn't know where the money was going to come from, and I didn't know who was going to pay for the supplies, but we called all of the hospitals, we called the grocery stores, we called every place we could think of for blankets, for sleeping bags, for food, for medical supplies, and by the end of that day, which was less than 24 hours after the earthquake, we were ready to go. It was on the plane that we did the planning as to what we would do and how the team would be organized and operate. And we landed there at 7 o'clock in the evening after a 6-hour flight, and the reception was tremendous. We were the first visible expression of help coming from the United States.
That was the amazing thing about the Army. When we left San Francisco, I didn't know personally that we didn't have clearance to land in Mexico City. We didn't get that clearance to land until an hour before we actually landed in Mexico City, which was good because we didn't have any gas to go anywhere else. So, and to get around that bureaucracy red tape, that was great, because I feel that we should go right to the source, which we did, and start to provide our services. A lot of teams, as you know, we were the first American medical team into Mexico City after the quake. A lot of teams were tied up in red tape in the United States and border towns in Mexico and didn't get there till days later, when actually the help was needed now.
We walked into this chapel, into the church, and within minutes, people began to gather outside. The word had traveled through the neighborhood, through Colonia Morelos, on Calle Imprenta, that the Salvation Army had medical people here to help us. Immediately lines formed. That very day we saw over 100 patients in that afternoon, and it just mushroomed. It evolved into where we were forced to set up a clinic in the church. And on Monday, more patients, 150 or so, and Tuesday the same.
¿Qué es su nombre? ¿Qué es su nombre?
Medical teams went out from the clinic to tour the streets in response to calls for assistance. Meanwhile, more help for the damnificados was being planned back in San Francisco. One remarkable effort came from Chinatown, a community that does not normally look beyond its borders. The Salvation Army has been a vital presence in Chinatown for over 100 years.
The second day after the earthquake, and then there was an urge in my own heart that I was supposed to do something for our neighbors. And I was looking for Colonel Robinson, and I learned that he was already flew to Mexico City. So immediately, and I called together our own people and then talked to them, see what we should do and what we can do.
So the weekly Salvation Army television program in Chinese became its first fundraising telethon, which raised $160,000 for the damnificados of Mexico City.
I wish that you were here to watch the enthusiasm of the people. They came and all lining up to give. And statistically, and I guess we will never know exactly how many, because one person may bring in a donation of several hundred people. Everybody put $1 in. And then as you know, that these people, most of them come from the lower income bracket. And this is what's heartwarming. They save up and squeeze themselves from their very limited income because of their background. And they do sense that every little bit would help.
Offers of money and personnel were coming in from all over the world. From the Salvation Army in Chicago, for example, came a bilingual team, set up a unit to help handle the huge demand for information on missing persons. Thousands of inquiries were flooding in from anxious relatives. Centralized coordination of all these efforts was now needed, and Major David Michaels in Atlanta was appointed national coordinator.
But we developed a list of particular items that we were looking for: bedding, tents, pots and pans, utensils, plasticware, things of this nature that were in great need for a family who had lost everything but who needed some means of existing. And each section of the country, each one of our 4 territories and Canada, said, we think that these items are manufactured, are on hand, that we can secure in this region of the country. And so we really divided the country up by territories, and each territory selected a certain category of items that they would try to secure. But early on the problem was, how is it to be sent?
Major Michaels didn't have long to wait for the answer. Airlines, railroads, and trucking companies promptly volunteered their services to the Salvation Army, free of charge, to move freight and personnel into Mexico City. A network of transportation was coordinated that spread across the United States and Canada. First and foremost, however, there was an urgent need for mobile food supplies. Since the Texas division was closest, they got the call.
We mobilized our canteens just a few days after the earthquake had hit. We packed the canteens with supplies ranging from radio communication equipment, tents for the homeless, food for the hungry. We went out and purchased gloves for the workers that would be doing the work, and knew that we would have to set off for the Mexico City area.
It was a journey of close to 2,000 miles. After driving around the clock non-stop for 36 hours, the crews reached Mexico City, and the canteens were put immediately to work.
Because people have to abandon their homes, were evacuated from the areas they were living. People didn't take anything with them. They were just trying to save their lives. Therefore, they were living in the streets. People had nothing else more than what they were wearing. This is where we came in, and we start in this area particularly, where the #1 core is to feed, since the first day, from 3,000 to 4,000 people every day. The first shipment that arrived was from San Francisco when Colonel Robinson came with his team of people, a medical team. They also brought a big amount of food that was very helpful, because in those days was no transportation, was no places open to get the things, and we just keep going with the program, helping the people.
Nighttime presented an eerie landscape. Rescue teams continued to excavate around the clock. Territorial Commander Colonel Kelvin Ivany, a Canadian, directed the Salvation Army Support Services. Periodically, work would stop to listen for the voices of those who might still be trapped. Each day, when the sun rose, it revealed more additions to a whole new city. Every scrap of open space was now crowded with makeshift shelters. Tents, blankets, and clothing were the next priorities.
We lodged much as people was possible in our shelters, but was never enough. Not only us, really people in Mexico really opened their homes and they opened their places, wherever it was possible to make a shelter for the people. But even so, thousands and thousands of them were just sleeping on the streets, which is a very sad situation. Therefore, we asked to the Salvation Army in the States to send us plenty tents, which they did. Came from all means, by plane or by the ship or by land, just arrived. And since we already were feeding the people, we just gave them tents by families. And just outside here, we were able to put about 100 of them just in this street. We closed the street on both sides and put a camp. But this is just one sample because we had camps all over in different areas of the city.
The clinic at Corps Number 1 was now in full swing, and new medical teams arrived.
We were like the fourth group that came in, and so what had started very, very primitive was already taking shape into a more formalized situation and clinic. And but as each group came, they seemed to extend and do their own little thing, and it became more detailed, and we even got involved in paperwork.
Out in the community, other members of the team were tackling other problems, like architect Tom Turman.
There's another big aftershock, a 6 or something, that's the kind of failure that's going to happen again. Those things are going to come off into the street. So what I'm trying to do is tell people where not to stay outside in the street. This one's fairly obvious. Nobody's staying here, but in many cases it's not obvious. The only way you can tell is to go along and evaluate the failure system right underneath an eyebrow overhang or a parapet.
With the cooperation of the local schools, Turman organized teams of architecture students to inspect the damaged buildings in Colonial Morelos and categorize them according to their condition. He then visited those who were potentially dangerous to warn the people who were still living there.
I think it was the right decision. I made it fairly quickly and instantaneously while driving in my car to come down here to get involved with the Salvation Army. My experience has been that the organization that gets started very early saves some lives. Without any organization from diplomats and political stuff, you get in there and you start talking, you move things, you start talking with everybody you can, you move people out of the way. Just physically grab and move them out of the way. That kind of stuff helps right in the beginning.
The earthquake had ruptured many water and sewage mains, and now there was a critical shortage of drinking water. Despite warnings, many people were taking contaminated water right out of the open sewers, which brought the deadly threat of a typhoid epidemic. The problem was serious. One of the solutions was ingenious, involving, of all things, a cruise ship. The Star Dancer was about to sail from Seattle to Miami via the Panama Canal. The owners offered to take relief supplies from Mexico City and drop them off at Acapulco. Great, said the Army. And while you're at it, how about taking some of our trucks as well? That they did, and for good measure, they also took a huge water purification plant. This plant, the only one of its kind in the world, had been offered by its owners to Mexico City, complete with 2 operators. It was a tall order, but a small army of volunteers came through.
People were fabulous, and it was amazing all the different areas that were involved in this. We had the ports that had to open up their ports for us, have special cranes. We had containers that were donated to us. The Longshoremen Union had to allow their workers to come and work for free, donate their time. We had stevedores, we had pilots that had to move the ship. It was really something.
I flew down to Mexico City and then went on down to Acapulco and spent a couple days there arranging with local drivers who had vehicles that could help to haul material for us to Mexico City. We also had a couple of our own trucks on the ship, and there were 4 large containers loaded. They had to be unloaded and moved onto the truck because the containers couldn't come off the ship. They had a regular long, like a chain gang, trying to unload that material, which we were able to accomplish. It was quite a feat to see them move the ship out and back it in to the dock and then tie it in there and hold it in position, trying to unload that material.
Without stopping for sleep, the drivers of the heavily laden convoy of trucks set off through the night, over the mountains, to Mexico City. The water purification plant went right to work in Colonia Morelos. It was hooked up to the contaminated mains and began running around the clock to provide clean water. It produced 15,000 gallons of purified water every day. This was distributed to families in plastic-lined boxes, each containing 6 gallons. As the weeks proceed, the first shock of the crisis is now over. The demolition of some 1,600 unsafe buildings has now begun, with sledgehammers, blow by blow. The whole city echoes to their leaden cadence. The dead are buried, the injured are regaining their health. The damnificados struggle to rebuild their lives. Their most urgent need now is for housing. The Salvation Army is helping with a solution developed from its experience with the Guatemala earthquake in 1976. Block building machines to provide the cement blocks to build modest homes. They are put up by the people themselves as a community activity under the guidance of Canadian officer Colonel David Brewer and a local Mexican architect. There are 2 plants, each producing 4,000 blocks a day. Slowly, 1 block at a time, the journey back begins. On the hills overlooking the city, at the Salvation Army Children's Home, another form of reconstruction is taking place on a tinier, yet no less important scale. Some of the children who were left orphans by the earthquake are finding a new family to try to replace the one they had lost. Volunteers who went to Mexico City have returned to their normal lives, but no one has been unaffected by the experience. Many of the civilian volunteers have continued their relationship with the Army and its work. In Los Angeles, a canteen is making the evening meal run to the people who sleep in cardboard boxes. On board is Bram Bailey.
It really affected my life. I think more than anything else, it gave me the opportunity to serve, to do something for somebody else. It helped me to center myself in terms of my priorities and about what's really important. I mean, that's why I think it's important to do these things. I mean, I get so involved with my own career, my own life in writing and in doing PR that you forget about others. And this is a good way to focus yourself, to come back is to serve and to do something for somebody else.
In San Francisco, at the Salvation Army Home for the Aged, the residents are having a get-together. Joining in is Colonel Robinson. Back from Mexico City, he hasn't forgotten them. On the other side of the country, one of the poorest sections of New York City, Gordon Sparks has returned from Mexico City to his mission in the South Bronx.
There are the damnificados in Mexico City, and it was obvious that their situation was a dire one and was a sad one. People around the world knew that from the coverage of the media. But there are damnificados in other parts of the world as well that aren't as widely covered. And there are damnificados right here in the South Bronx. Right? You with me so far? And Pharaoh, he gets all burned up and says, they don't want to go worship, they're lazy. So I'm going to make their work harder. And then the foreman, the Israelite foreman, who are in charge of the workers, the guys whose work is now going to get harder, what do they say, Ralph? We do many specific kinds of things. We minister many specific kinds of ways. If people are in need of food, we try to help them find that food. If they need shelter, we try to help them find that shelter, etc. But probably the greatest contribution we can make is just to be present with the people and to show them that they are not alone in their struggle. And I think in Mexico City, what we contributed most was our presence. And not only did I sense that from my own perspective, but I also heard it from the mouths of the Mexicans. Just to see us brought many of them to tears. They realized that just the way we looked, the way we spoke, they realized that we weren't Mexicans. And it was very moving for them to realize that we were there present with them, willing to stand alongside, even if we had nothing to say or, for that matter, nothing to give.
They would come back on a return visit when we said, bring your child back in 3 days or 4 days to the clinic. They would come back and they would bring some fruit, or they would have brought a little doll or a little ornament that they had carved, and you knew they had nothing, that they were living in a tent in the streets, and yet they wanted to show their appreciation. The mother would tell the child, kiss the doctor in Spanish, and you didn't want to wash your face because that was an important thing. You hoped that you had helped with the health of that child.
These people lost everything they had in terms of material possessions, but they did not collapse morally and emotionally underwritten because their friends were there for them. So what's really important is the family ties and the person-to-person ties that one established. That is at a personal level in my own life. I also was exposed to a group of people that are of high caliber. I have made new friends, so my life has been enhanced. I have received a whole lot more than I've given.
So the story of the Salvation Army relief effort in Mexico City turns out to be many stories: an act of caring, a network of ingenious logistics, an insight into the dignity of simple people, and an unexpected journey of self-discovery for the volunteers. Together, they provide an eloquent insight into what the Salvation Army is all about, finding a way, as they put it, with heart to God and hand to man, for all of us to respond to our better instincts in helping those who are less fortunate. Los Damnificados, whoever and wherever they might be.